And I appreciate Jim's paper. As he noted at the beginning of the paper, I've seen one version of this before in its initial stage. I missed the presentation of the second version, and it's, although it was given at Princeton, and it's grown and evolved quite a bit since then, like Jim's version of the Constitution as well. So it's been interesting to see the paper in this form as well, and it's an interesting paper with a lot of interesting pieces to it. I just wanted to talk about a few really big picture items from the paper and save some more specific thoughts on some more particular elements that may come out in the discussion later. I also didn't try to follow up more specifically to Jim's oral comments, so what I'm going to say here doesn't quite match up with what Jim said orally, but takes off from the paper itself. So as Jim notes, he begins with this big question of, are we all originalist now? And Jim, of course, is concerned that maybe we are. I think the answer is clearly not. I haven't been doing this for a long time, not as long as some have, but when I started, my impression was that most people thought that only fools and knaves were originalists. My impression is most people still think that, which suggests that we're not all originalists now. But there are more people that are willing to concede that not everyone who's an originalist is a fool or a knave. And there's more historical work being done in an originalist vein, and at least some originalists are taken somewhat more respectfully now than they were, say, 10 or 15 years ago, and certainly than they were 20 or 30 years ago. So that suggests there is at least a little bit of convergence, although not exactly like everybody's an originalist. And I think there's movement on both sides of the divide generally. And as we've sort of seen here, and as is frequently talked about, on the originalist side, I think there are significant shifts theoretically toward, for example, greater emphasis on the text and versions of textualism, greater emphasis on public meaning originalism, greater emphasis on abstraction, all of which moves originalism a bit more toward what various kinds of critics of originalism had emphasized at various points, but also on the non-originalist side, and I think thinking strictly in terms of those dichotomies is, of course, silly in various other contexts. If this was a conference about other kinds of theories, we'd talk about those theories and the opponents of those theories, and we'd have a different dichotomy. So it's not like the whole world's divided into originalism and non-originalism, but for now we can talk about originalists and non-originalists. But on the non-originalist side, I think likewise there's been significant shifts over time to emphasize questions of interpretation and fit in ways that are more consistent with things that originalists are also thinking about, and make for a conversation in which there are certain commonalities between non-originalist and originalist as well. But having said that, there's still lots of things to argue about and disagree about between originalists and their critics. And it's worth trying to identify exactly where those points of tensions and disagreements are. I don't think those things emerge quite clearly, though, in Jim's paper as it's written here, and so I'd like to try to tease out where I think some of the central disagreements still are, or at least lay on the table where I think some of the central disagreements still are, and perhaps Jim can tell me if I'm wrong about those. So, for example, I think one of the central disagreements still are fundamentally what exactly the judicial role is in a constitutional democracy, and what exactly justifies it. There's disagreements among originalists on this front as well, but I think there are substantial disagreements between originalists in general and non-originalists or their critics about what exactly the scope of the judicial role in exercising judicial review is, and what the right way of justifying judicial review is, and how the courts ought to exercise the power of judicial review might be, and that's largely somewhat separable from theories of constitutional interpretation per se, although it links up in various ways to theories of constitutional interpretation. There's also important disagreements about how binding the known constitutional meaning of the constitutional text is. So once we know what the meaning of the constitutional text might be, that's once we know what the historical meaning of the constitutional text is, once you grant originalism that much, how binding might that be? And under what circumstances might we trump it? Under what circumstances might we ignore it? Under what circumstances might other kinds of things become more important, whether it's precedent, concerns about moral theories, concerns about consequences, et cetera. When can judges ignore it? When can other political actors ignore it or trump it or worry about its fit with other kinds of things that we also take as being important as well? And I suspect that overall originalists tend to have somewhat different answers about that kind of question than various kinds of non-originalists as well. And then there are practical issues that have to be worked out about how much do we actually know about what a given text means. And of course, that's a problem that is largely within the originalist camp, and that's a difficulty that leads to internal debates among originalists at a theoretical level, but a lot of that's a practical issue about actually working through the originalist practice of figuring out what particular textual components mean, and at that level I tend to lose interest. Let me turn then to another feature of the paper. How much time do I have as I turn to another feature of the paper?
You've got 3 to 5
3 to 5 minutes,
minutes.
excellent. And that is that Jim wants to make a great deal of what he calls the originalist premise. And this is where he accuses originalism of being axiomatic and question-begging and circular. And the originalist premise, as he notes, is what he thinks is originalists want to say that interpretation requires originalism, and that simply, for originalist, is what interpretation is. And so originalism simply is axiomatic about certain kinds of claims about the nature of interpretation. In the paper, at least, he proceeds simply by quoting some conclusions in originalist theories, for example, mine, and then acting like those are premises of arguments rather than that those were conclusions of arguments, and then ignoring all the arguments that came before the conclusions that led to those, and then says, aha, they are axiomatic. It'd be helpful if you actually engaged the arguments that led to those conclusions, and then we could see whether or not the arguments are persuasive or not. Perhaps they're not persuasive in leading to those particular conclusions, but they aren't exactly axioms that lead to those. I think oftentimes they are, and I would say that in many cases they were, and that's problematic. But in other cases, they are, in fact, conclusions that follow arguments, and if that's true, we want to see whether or not those conclusions are persuasive or not, as to whether or not originalism makes sense of a given interpretive project, whether or not originalism follows from certain kinds of premises about the way in which interpretation works, whether it makes sense of a certain kind of interpretive practice that we engage in. And to that degree, the question is not simply, is this simply what interpretation is, but is originalism the best way of realizing how to engage in an interpretive process. There may be other ways of trying to accomplish interpretation, but there are going to be better and worse ways as a matter of practice of trying to accomplish what you're trying to do when you're interpreting a text. And originalist practice is trying to accomplish that more effectively, I would argue, than other kinds of efforts to engage it. Or alternatively, you can simply do something else. So, for example, the kind of integrative effort that Tom describes is a separate kind of project, and we can describe that kind of project separately. And again, that would be one potential area of disagreement between originalists and others as to is that what courts ought to be doing instead of the sort of principal agent kind of model about what it is that courts ought to be doing instead when they're exercising a power of judicial review. And I think that, again, falls into this point of potential disagreement between originalists and non-originalists about what it is fundamentally courts ought to be doing when they exercise judicial review. So I think this takes us then to what is one of the real issues of disagreement that come across in the paper, which appears on page, or potential issues of disagreement, it appears on page 27 of the paper. Near the bottom where Jim says, in the dimension of fit, history helps or should help screen out off-the-wall interpretations or purely utopian interpretations, but often does not lead conclusively to any interpretation, let alone the best interpretation. And I wrote beside that, do I disagree with that? Because I'm not sure I do, right? Because fundamentally, it seems to me often right that the effort to engage in interpretations is about screening out off-the-wall interpretations, but often leads to important indeterminacies still remaining about what exactly a particular text means. But it depends a lot on what the particular text is that we have in mind and how much information we have about it. So a lot depends on what text we're dealing with, how much information we have about it, and those are empirical questions. And so if we're talking generally about all texts, if we make the assumption that all texts look like that, then we've got some important disagreements between us. If we want to say about a particular text, do originalists rule out, or should originalists rule out, as a general matter, that's impossible to arise in that situation, then I see no reason why originalists would want to rule that out. Instead, I want to argue that, in fact, originalists fully want to recognize that, that the interpretive process is precisely about trying to narrow the scope of what you can do with a particular piece of text, trying to limit the set of possibilities that a given piece of text might hold, limit the zone of construction. And once you've done that, then the interpretive process may well be at an end. And at that point, you're forced to do other things if you want to move forward in order to resolve disputes, to know what to do, to develop a working constitution at that point. And that may suggest, what's that say? Time. Oh, there you go. And at that point, it may suggest that there's relatively little disagreement between the two of us about what the process and project of elaborating a constitution looks like. Our disagreements may fundamentally be about our assessment of what our actual constitution looks like in terms of how indeterminate the text we have actually is. Or then it may cycle back to these questions I identified in the first place, which is what exactly the judicial role is, how active the courts ought to be in that particular process, or how much we should be able to trump known historical meaning when we can actually figure out what the Constitution meant from a historical perspective. Are we allowed to trump it, and under what circumstances? But interestingly enough, Jim seems to not suggest very much about being able to trump that known historical meaning. He seems to suggest that if we know what the Constitution means from that perspective, we're bound to it in certain important ways. And if that's true, then we've made a lot of progress in being on the same page. Thanks.